So as you know, on the first Sunday of each month, we do corporate prayer, and then we kind of do things a little bit differently. We call them devotional Sundays. We do different content, right? We kind of take a break from the textual study that we tend to focus on, the expository textual analysis, and we've been going back and forth through the books of Matthew and Exodus. So today I'm really excited because I've been wanting to talk about C.S. Lewis's argument from desire, and I realized last night, like, wait a second, Kendra and I are going to see a movie on C.S. Lewis tomorrow, so it just happens to be the day that I'm doing it, so I'm really excited about that. But just so you know, this movie is in theaters now. It was kind of a silent release. It released on the 3rd, and then there weren't any more showings until the 7th. And so if you're interested in the story of C.S. Lewis, go watch it. And it's not just a biographical thing. It's supposed to be apologetics-based. It's supposed to appeal to the believer and skeptic alike. And so I'd encourage you to see that. But on that note, we are going to be covering today C.S. Lewis's argument from desire. And this is a particular argument for the existence of God that moves me deeply, personally. It stirs something within me. And so today it's going to be a little bit more of an intellectual exercise, but there are going to be some concrete application points at the end, and I hope it's an encouragement to you. I hope that you come away with this with a few more tools in your tool belt as it relates to sharing your faith, evangelism. I hope it just stirs up in you a sense of wonder, almost a childlike wonder, this wonder that we tend to repress as we get older, right? That we tend to stifle. And when we look at the way our education's done, we look at the world, this sense of wonder seems to be squashed at an early age, right? And I hope to stir that within you. Whether or not I'm successful, that remains to be seen, but that's my intention. And so there are going to be some practical takeaways, there's going to be some spiritual takeaways, and maybe even some emotional appeal. And you should have some sheets out there. If you don't have some, there's some spares right here. I'm just going to leave them on this front chair. And these aren't the specific points we're necessarily going to be discussing. These are more for your own intellectual study and exercise, okay? And as we go through the lesson for today, they'll make a bit more sense. And I've given you some space that you can take notes on what we're talking about today. And so, C.S. Lewis's argument from desire. You've heard me before speak on Christian happiness, right? I did a lesson, I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 months ago on Christian eudaimonia. That is the Greek word for happiness, on Christian happiness, and where our happiness is found, and not looking at the things around us for lasting joy and peace, right? For not looking to the things around us as these things that we serve, not elevating them to the position of God. And it's out of these kind of motivations that C.S. Lewis says argument for the existence of God from desire manifest. And now there are many arguments for the existence of God, and some are more convincing than others, right? Many of the arguments are probabilistic. That is to say that if you were a betting man or woman, then the reasonable position would be to conclude that there is a transcendent creator of things. I was trained in philosophy at seminary. We did theology, we did Bible, and my major emphasis was philosophy. And so I was very much interested in the conclusive arguments for God's existence. And they are out there, right? They're definitive, they're robust. The problem is they're very philosophical and technical in nature. So while there are arguments for the existence of God that are definitive, that is, the conclusions necessarily follow from the premises that God exists. They're definitive, but they're very difficult for the average layperson, the average churchgoer to understand, and so they become inaccessible. You may have recalled when we did our lesson on systematic theology, we had covered a couple of these arguments just to make you aware, but if you recall, if you were here during that time, they were fairly difficult to follow. They require some background information, right? They're often unconvincing to us because they're purely technical head arguments, right? They require a lot of study and a lot of reasoning and understanding. And most people don't have the time for that. Not everybody can be an armchair philosopher and engage with these types of things, right? And most of the people out in the world aren't doing these things, right? They're not looking for philosophical arguments for the existence of God. They're looking for something that's felt, something that's real. And so while I think it's good for us as Christians to investigate the deep intellectual things of the faith, it's good for us to engage in philosophy, if for no other reason than to be able to repudiate bad philosophy. Those things are good. But Christianity is more than an intellectual exercise. It's much more. It is known, it is experienced, it is felt, and it is good. And so, why do I say all this? It's because the argument from desire is not one of those purely technical head arguments. I think a good argument, one that's more convincing, is one that appeals both to the head and the heart. That is a good argument, is sound to reason. It meets man where he's at in his experience, and it elevates his affections to consider the splendor of his conclusions. In short, I think an effective argument, and I'm not using argument in a negative sense, I'm just referring to a dialogue where you try to come to some conclusion. I think a good argument serves as a vehicle for those things which we hold most dear. Things like truth, beauty, and goodness. And I think Lewis understood this in his writings. He has an amazing way of communicating profound truth at a level that pretty much anyone can understand. And his argument from desire is one that appeals to the human experience. It appeals to this desire that is universal to all humans. And what is that universal desire he's referring to? It's this inclination to pursue lasting joy, lasting happiness. This is fairly undisputed. It is a fairly undisputed fact of human experience that we are constantly searching for something to fill us. Okay? Even atheists, even the nihilist Friedrich Nietzsche, recognize that. Now, atheists and especially nihilists, they'll just dismiss it as a mere human defect, right? They'll try to explain it away. This is a defect, this is an evolutionary mistake, or this is a psychological construct. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that, comparatively speaking, humans are the biggest failures, the sickliest animals who have strayed the most dangerously far from their instincts. What is he talking about there? He has several things in mind, but one of the main things he's talking about is that there is this seemingly universal urge for us to transcend our material world, to take hold of something that isn't here. We're constantly looking for this transcendent, lasting, complete joy. Now he regards it as a mistake, as a sort of psychological or evolutionary mistake. Now, for all of human history, for all of human recorded history, the fact of religious expression and experience as a means to take hold of that transcendent joy has prevailed. Nihilism is in the minority. People who say all is meaningless, there's no point to life, my life is worth nothing are in the minority. And I submit to you, it's only after a lot of education that people get there. Not education, bad education, that people get to that point. Now, the universality of religious expression, how people are constantly searching to fill themselves, to be complete, to be happy, this says something about man. It says something about us, right? That there seems to be this innate desire, this natural desire for something more than this world has to offer. And we see this through the relentless pursuit that mankind has gone. Pursuing things, pursuing persons, pursuing causes. And then we consider the fact that ultimate questions of origin, questions about where we came from, where do we come from? Questions about meaning, why am I here? Questions about morality, what is the good that I should pursue? Questions about purpose, where am I going? Questions about joy, where can I find lasting joy? How can I feel complete? These kinds of questions have ever been on the mind of man. Now, does it seem reasonable that this incessant, unrelenting urge is just the result of chemical evolutionary processes? Just the result of physical law? Does that seem reasonable? Was that funny? Okay. Were you laughing at how unreasonable that was? No. Very good. What would it even mean to trust our reason if our reason is just the product of a collection of molecules banging together? What would make my reason any different than the ape's reason? It just doesn't seem believable. Now, observations such as these are what motivated Lewis's argument from desire. And in recent years, that's the name it's been given, the argument for the existence of God from desire. C.S. Lewis didn't call it that, so you're not going to find that specific reference to this argument in his writings, but it's throughout his fiction and non-fiction work. There's this constant appeal to the eternal, a constant appeal to another country that we're meant for. And so, without delay, let's go ahead and jump into the argument. I'd like to present it as C.S. Lewis himself presented it in Mere Christianity, because he's just going to do it a lot better than I can. Now, just from the outset, he doesn't present the argument in like a strict, logical form. You may have seen, maybe you took a logic class. I know they're kind of trying to get those out of school now. But maybe you've taken a logic class before, and an example of a syllogism, they just call them syllogisms now, and so they don't do them. But a syllogism is you have, two statements and a conclusion, right? So an example might be, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore, Socrates is mortal. See, it's you don't even have to think about it, right? It's natural, right? He doesn't present the argument that way. Now, we are going to get to this argument, and we're going to put it into that form, because I think having it in that form in your mind can help you think about it, formalize it, see how the conclusions necessarily follow from the premises. But he didn't record it that way in his writings. Now, he begins the argument in his section on hope in his book, Mere Christianity. And hope is something that we all hope for something. We know what hope is, right? It's this looking to something beyond the present, beyond the now, the looking forward to the possession of something. And in this regard, he's talking about a specific kind of hope, this hope for something that will satisfy this deep, mysterious longing of the human heart. Now, to be sure, some stifle this hope. and try to satisfy it with many other things. And we'll get to those kinds of questions. But for the Christian, hope is considered a theological virtue. And Lewis writes, "It is a continual looking forward to the eternal world, and is not, as some modern people think, a form of escapism or wishful thinking, but one of the things a Christian is meant to do." As Christians, we recognize this hope in the eternal things, right? The hope of heaven, the hope of peace with God and fellow man, the hope of eternal, lasting, and complete happiness. But one of the problems I find even among Christians is that even we ourselves tend to suppress this hope. We forget the cry of David, who said to God, "Restore to me the joy of my salvation." And many of us, our education or what we've been through, it's almost become obscure to us how to hope, how to nurture this hope. Lewis writes, "Most of us find it very difficult to want heaven at all, except insofar as heaven means meeting again our friends who have died. One reason for this difficulty is that we have not been trained. Our whole education tends to fix our minds on this world. Another reason is that when the real want for heaven is present to us, we do not recognize it. Most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know what they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world." And so this argument appeals to the listener to practice some honest introspection, to look within themselves, to recognize that they have a deep-seated need for something that this world cannot satisfy. And this is undeniable. At every turn, we're met with things that seem to offer us happiness, yet we can pursue on, right? More. Once we've obtained what we thought would make us happy, once we finally grasped that thing that we thought would satisfy, it just quickly fades into oblivion, right? You'll never relive the moment of your wedding day. You can remember it, but you'll never relive that. It's evasive. Joy is evasive. True lasting joy is evasive. And there are different ways that people have turned to deal with this. And Lewis describes 3 different paths. He describes the fool's way, the way of the disillusioned man, sensible man, and the Christian way. And so we're going to go through these and just consider the different ways that people have pursued lasting happiness. Now, we'll get to why this is called the way of the fool in a moment. But I'd like to turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, because I think there's a lot in the book of Ecclesiastes that just really picks up on, well, not really picks up on because it was written before, but it parallels or it complements what Lewis is talking about. And the way of the fool seems to be the most common way. It seems to be what people do, right? You know, it's a posture of blaming the objects themselves that they pursue as not being the right thing. This thing, this person, this cause did not satisfy. Hence, maybe if I tried something else the world offers, I'll finally find lasting happiness. So turning to Ecclesiastes, we see that we have an individual who did this. And so the writer, traditionally attributed to King Solomon, he writes, "I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind." And so the writer of Ecclesiastes, he's undertaking a very particular task here. He's trying to find the meaning of life. What is good for men to do under the sun? What is worthwhile? This phrase, under the sun, it refers to the entirety of one's life. All the days we're under the sun until we die, right? What is it worthwhile to do? And he went and tried many different things. He pursued education. He writes, then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. This phrase, chasing after the wind. Have you ever chased after the wind?
Wind chased me yesterday.
It chased you. It caught you, didn't it? The wind can catch you, but you can't catch it. Right? Grasping after the wind as if he could take hold. He's looking for this thing that will satisfy. But when he attempts to take hold of it, it's like grasping after the wind. It's elusive. He can't get it. He sought this thing in pleasure and indulgence. He said, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. He also sought it in meaning, wealth, possessions, and industry. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. And so we see here, the writer claims to have denied himself nothing, right? The world would look at this and say, this is the way. This is what I want to do, right? Well, he did it. And he concludes, what does he conclude about these things? It's meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Indeed, he even becomes angry at the very objects of his pursuit. He hated them because it was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. He says in chapter 2, starting in verse 10, so I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. In verse 16, for the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days, their work is grief and pain. Even at night, their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. Does this sound familiar? You know, I'm not like a depressive person. I mean, at least I don't think I am. Some of you might think I'm depressed because I don't really show a lot of emotion. I don't think I'm depressed. But, you know, there's various times in my life where I'm just looking at the things around me. You know, what's the point? What's the point of all this? It's all going to pass away. It's all going to be gone. Look at my family. You know, who's to say nothing terrible is not going to happen to us? Who's to say that I don't die of a heart attack at a young age? Just look at everything. It's just, I've had these thoughts. They're fears, right? But it's also just, well, what is this? And it's times in my life when I've lost proper perspective. I've lost my gratitude for the things that God has given me. I've lost sight of whom I'm made for. And we see this in the world around us. You hear stories of people who have had everything. They have had all they wanted. And it was pointless to them. I've heard many conversion stories around those kinds of circumstances where people, they have amassed wealth, they have all the joys and pleasures they could want. It's like, is this it? Is this all there is? And what the writer here is appealing to is like, all that we achieve on earth will pass away. The same fate that overtakes the foolish and the poor also overtakes the rich and the wise. Death. You know, I don't know if you've thought about it. I'm kind of a math guy, so is Stephen. I'm sure we think about statistics much more than most people. Rigo's in finance, right? So he thinks about numbers a lot. And there's a lot of statistics out there. There's none like death. Death has a very impressive statistic, doesn't it?
And taxes.
And taxes?
Can't avoid them.
You can't avoid them. Taxes and death. All is meaningless. Right? And so the writer of Ecclesiastes, he cannot find what he's looking for. It's a grasping after the wind. Everything he pursued seemed like a grasping after the wind. Now, the writer of Ecclesiastes and Lewis's fool suffered the same affliction. They're both trying to find satisfaction for a desire that cannot be achieved or obtained by things in this world. Now, a lot of people go through Ecclesiastes and they're like, this is a depressing book. You know, what is wrong with this guy? You know? He comes around, though. He observes everything before him, all that he's amassed, all his wealth, all the luxury, all the things the world has to offer. And what does he say at the very end of the book? The last two verses. Now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. He could not find what he was searching for. He could not find what his heart desired in this world, because the longing of his heart was not of this world, but of another. You get a hint of this earlier in the book, and in chapter 3, where he writes, you know, God has set eternity into the hearts of men. And so you see that verse, you know, okay, there's some hope here, and then it's just all meaningless until the very last chapter. But unlike Lewis's fool, the writer of Ecclesiastes finds that which gives meaning to all things. He finds that which his heart desired all along. Now remember what we're discussing. We're discussing the different paths that people take who are confronted with this ever-present reality, this ever-present longing that no identifiable thing on this earth seems to satisfy. And so the reason that this is called the way of the fool is because one is seeking satisfaction for a desire that can only be satisfied outside the world. Rather than admit that one was made for another world, the fool continues trying to satisfy himself with things of the world. An analogy might help in this regard. You know, imagine you have a fencing project that you're about to complete. And you need to somehow drive some nails through a board or something to a post or something like that. You're trying to drive nails through a board to attach it to a post or something like that, right? And so you go to your toolbox and look in your toolbox and you find some nuts and bolts. You find some pliers, a straight edge. You know, maybe you find a wrench here, a screwdriver, carpenter's knife, and you just start trying things out. You just start trying out, you hitting it with the straight edge. Well, it doesn't seem to budge at all. Hit it with the pliers. Okay, you got crooked nails now. Nothing is able to drive the nails in through the board. You just have bent nails sticking out everywhere. And so in frustration, you throw down the board and you start rummaging through your toolbox again. And your spouse comes out and says, honey, or honey, I don't know. Some of you may be industrious women. Honey, why don't you use your hammer, which is on the table right there? And you reply, no, there must be something in my toolbox that will accomplish this task. Okay? That's a fool's errand, isn't it? It's the same way with the one who tries to find lasting happiness transcendent joy in the world of things rather than God. And so that's Lewis's point. That's his point. You have the way of the fool. Now, the way of the disillusioned, sensible man is a bit different. In this case, eventually the fool stops being a fool and becomes sensible. Not really sensible, that's why it's in little air quotes there. Becomes sensible, and because he can't find anything to satisfy this desire, he just concludes there isn't anything that satisfies the desire. It's like the man who looks in his toolbox with a hammer sitting right there, and he says, well, I guess I don't have anything that's going to drive this nail through. So I guess I just won't get this project done. Right? And then he just rests in that. Okay? Lewis writes, and so he settles down and learns not to expect too much and represses the part of him which used to, as he would say, to cry for the moon. This is, of course, a much better way than the first. It makes a man much happier and less of a nuisance to society. And so what Lewis brings out here is that the, quote, sensible man is one who looks at this longing, looks at this desire for something more than this world and just says, there's nothing there that will satisfy it. This is just some kind of childish belief I have, maybe akin to like the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus or, I don't know, fairies living in the garden. I think that's one of the examples Lewis uses. It's a childish story. We know about children, right? Children are enraptured by fairy stories, stories of dragons and magic and all kinds of things, right? All kinds of wondrous and mysterious things. And they're unceasingly curious, right? They pursue and explore all kinds of things through their imaginations, through the stories they read, through their play. It's just evident. It's almost like it's a natural inclination on the part of the child to long for and pursue the wonderful and the magnificent. And I remember, to an infant, everything is a miracle, right? I mean, if anyone here that has had kids, you may remember those first couple weeks where everything you just put in front of your baby, and the eyes are just like, oh, it's like everything's a miracle to them, right? It's incredible. I think it's hilarious. Look at this. Okay, look at this. Everything's magical to them. To the toddler, everything is to be explored, climbed, broken, beaten, put in their mouth. All children do these things. Ronya, she will not stop putting things in her mouth. Even things that she knows are icky. She'll go, okay, pick up a nasty leaf. She looks at me. I go, ooh, icky. And she goes, puh, and then she starts laughing. Just to see my response. Right? They're constantly exploring and putting new things in their mouths. Right? It's like, I don't know how many times I have to tell her, no, okay, can't you see that's not food? Just rock, stick, chalk, crayon, electrical wire, whatever, right? She's unrelenting. And all children do these things. It's a sign of a healthy child, right? But one grows up. We grow up and the mundane things become less magical to us. We tend to see the beliefs and wonderings of our youth as just that, beliefs and wonderings of our youth. Childish things. And so the conclusion that the disillusioned, sensible man comes to is like, this inner longing for transcendent joy is just like that. Okay? It's just like that. There is nothing in the world that satisfies the longing for more than this world. Because of that, the longing itself must be a farce. And it's a cruel one, if you ask me, if that's the case. It's a cruel trick of nature, if that's the case. Now, we're just going to analyze that a little bit. Does this seem reasonable to you? Does this really seem like the reasoning of a sensible man? I mean, this natural longing for the wonderful, for more than this world, is universal. It's a longing that's expressed by even the youngest of children. Is it really just a cruel trick of nature? Is it a random expression or a random arrangement of a conglomerate of particles? Is that all it is? It doesn't seem reasonable to me. Because we have this very felt and experienced and even enjoyed sense of the wonderful in our longings. What is that? Where did it come from? Why can't we satisfy it by things in this world? And we'll talk a little bit more about the joy of that longing here in a moment. And so Lewis's third way, or third path, is the Christian way. And as I said before, I can't do a better job of expressing it than he can, so I'll just let him do the explaining. The Christian says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And so for the Christian, this longing that we have, it's not just this unsatisfied desire. It's not merely a child's wishful thinking. It's also not a thing that just loiters around, luring us and beguiling us endlessly into all forms of pleasures that never really satisfy. Pleasures that never really provide us what we're looking for. And it would, as I said before, it would be an odd thing, if not a cruel thing, for nature to give us a desire that is useless. One which has no practical end. One which has no corresponding object of desire. And that's what Lewis is getting at. We seem to have these natural, innate desires, all of which have a proper object of desire. But yet there's one that remains, that nothing in this world satisfies. And for the evolutionist, it seems incredibly difficult to explain away this desire. Puckett and Linville write in their work on the apologetics of joy, they write, "It would be a strange view of natural selection to have evolved a desire for an object that has never existed. Natural selection only selects that which is useful to life. It gives us what we need in order to survive in our environment. But what use is having a desire that has nothing at all to do with our environment?" And so Lewis's argument is this: we have this innate natural desire. Nothing in this world seems to satisfy it. So the object of that desire must be of something else, something more than this world. We're going to jump into formalizing the argument. As I said in the beginning, I'm going to give you kind of just like a line-by-line logical sequence for how you might articulate it. Obviously, whenever you're talking about somebody, you're going to probably take more of a C.S. Lewis approach in your conversations. But this can be helpful to kind of, go through your thing. Before we get to that, are there any questions, any comments, any thoughts, any castigations?
Yeah, I've got some observations or comments. First of all, what are you talking about? Fairies and dragons don't exist. And just the other one is Ronia. She's putting things in her mouth because she's trying to bring the whole human emotion out of you. Joy, anger, disgust, fear, and just confusion.
She's gonna see what she's gonna get out of it. Anything else?
That was it.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think so. The need that I think is expressed in a lot of people is this need for belonging, right? That's a big one.
Yeah.
Man is social, is a social creature. And whether we are more introverted, extroverted, whatever, we want to belong somewhere that we feel like we can. And where Christianity, I think, stands out, or at least where it ought to stand out, is you can belong here without a conformation of, without sacrificing your identity, right? So different worldviews or cults, you can belong to them if you adhere to their way of doing things. You lose your sense of your individual identity for the sake of the group identity, in a sense. Whereas Christianity, it's a unity through this diverseness and diversity that you maintain your individual identity with. And so we have this standout of Christianity amongst the other worldviews in this argument of desire as well.
Yeah. Now, I'll say what I was going to say here for a second. Anything else? You kind of look like you wanted to, but I wasn't sure.
I was just going to say that you were talking about evolutionists. They don't have an argument for this argument for desire, that we desire something that's transcendent. But what's sad is nihilism or nihilism, what you brought up earlier. That is like, you kind of have to respect that position because it is the logical outworking of evolution. Yeah. I've had a lot of luck with atheists because they don't recognize that that's the logical outworking of evolution. Is that it really doesn't make sense for you if we're all just evolved stardust. It doesn't make sense to desire something good because there is nothing good in evolution. So if you can understand that, bring them to the point of nihilism, and then say, well, do you believe that? Most of the time they're going to say no.
Yeah, so like I said, nihilism is in the minority. Just to qualify your statement, natural or material evolutionists, that's the logical conclusion. There are theistic evolutionists out there, like Francis Collins, but I think they're extremely inconsistent. So it's not the inevitable end of evolution. It's the inevitable end of a materialistic evolution. C.S. Lewis seems to have been a theistic evolutionist of a kind, which is interesting. In any case, before we move on, anything else? All right, I'm gonna start cracking here. So let's formalize the argument. Now, I'm just gonna show these to you one by one. And this argument is out of Peter Kreft's work, Handbook to Christian Apologetics, and it's a very good work. He is a Catholic, so if you pick that up, be discerning. But, nobody has a monopoly on the truth. All truth is God's truth. I think he does a good job with this argument. Every natural innate desire in us corresponds to some real object that can satisfy that desire. But there exists in us a natural innate desire which nothing in time, nothing on earth, no creature can satisfy. Therefore, there must exist something more than time, earth, and creatures which can satisfy this desire. And the last point is just a definition. This something is what people call God and life forever with God. Probably hard to see that, but it's kind of the logical flow. Because of the first premise, you go to the second. Because of the second, you go to the third. And the third is really just, it's kind of a definition. It doesn't necessarily follow. It's just a kind of stand-in for whatever this thing that is more than the world is. Okay, we call it God. Now, focusing on the first premise, it specifies a particular kind of desire, a natural, innate desire. Right? Now, why is that qualification there? It's there because it implies a distinction in desires. We naturally desire things like food, knowledge, friendship, beauty, truth, etc., right? These things don't really vary from person to person. They're universal. Okay? We have these innate universal desires. But there's other desires which do vary from person to person. They might be things like sports cars, right? Or flying through the air, or being in the land of Narnia, right? These are just external things. But unlike the first kind, the second kind of desires, which we'll call externally conditioned or artificial desires, for the artificial desires, there's no corresponding state of deprivation. And what does that mean? Well, you hunger, there's this thing called food. Okay, that's a natural thing, right? It's innate. Okay, you want to go to Narnia? Well, one does not simply walk into Narnia. There is no land of Narnia to satisfy your Narnia-lessness. Okay, so that's the point of the distinction. And it illustrates that there's two different kinds of desires, right? Now, the second premise just states, as we've been talking about this whole thing, there's this innate natural desire that nothing on earth, in time, or creatures can satisfy. This is what we've been talking about all along. And this is usually the premise that people will deny, like the disillusioned, sensible man. I think we've already shown it's not a reasonable position, but on this, I have a quote here. Where'd it go? Do I not have the quote for that? Forgot my quote. I'll just read it to you. Peter Criff says this: if you deny the first premise or second premise, if someone denies it and says, "I am perfectly happy playing with mud pies or sports car, or money or sex or power," we can only ask them, "Are you really?" But we can only appeal. We cannot compel. And we can refer such a person to the nearly universal testimony of human history and all its great literature. Even the atheist John Paul Sartre admitted that there comes a time when one asks, even of Shakespeare, even of Beethoven, is that all there is? Now, the third premise logically follows from the first and second taken together. And then point 4 is just a definition. Now, what's interesting about this argument, and what's important, is it doesn't really give you conceptual content to the idea of God. Okay? It does not get you to the God of the Bible. But it does get you to something more than the world has to offer. It points beyond to something that is, it points beyond the earth, it points beyond space, it points beyond time, it points beyond the objects in the earth. It points beyond the finite created order. And it points you to something that must be immaterial, that must be timeless, spaceless, something that must be infinitely more beautiful and magnificent and wonderful than anything that we're looking for here on the earth. Okay? To me, that sounds a lot like the Christian God, but if you're going to get to Christianity, there's a bit more work you have to do. It doesn't get you to Jesus, but it appeals to the existential longing of every human heart. That wonderful longing that even the youngest of children experience. And because of this, I think it can open the door to faith. It meets people where they're at in their experience. It points them beyond themselves, beyond this world, to something else. There must be something more. There must be something more. Now, so what? And I'll try to move through this quickly, as quickly as I can here. I know we're going over time here. To me, the argument is very moving. It stirs something within me to consider, what I'm made for, who I'm made for. And because of the conclusion of this argument, it forces us to evaluate, right? I can't think of myself the same ever again. That I have this desire for something, and that something's not going to be found in the world of things, but it's found in God. There is something wonderful, something mysterious, something more than anything this world has to offer that I'm meant for. How can our lives be the same? How can our pursuits be the same? When I know that all the things around me are temporary. They're not lasting. They do not provide that lasting peace and joy that I'm looking for. So now we'll get into some application here. And C.S. Lewis closes out the section with the following. He writes, if none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else, which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of my life to press on to that other country and to help others do the same. And so C.S. Lewis gives us 3 charges here that we can pick out of this statement. Treat things according to their proper value. The things around us, the goodness, the wonderfulness of the things in this life, those are just a mere shadow of what we're meant for. Treat things according to their proper value. Maintain an eternal perspective. And then treat others according to their true value. Going through these, we'll go through these rather quickly here. Lewis emphasizes that we must not make the mistake of treating the things of this world as the objects of our ultimate meaning and satisfaction. We will be disappointed by them. Now, this does not mean that we are to live as monks and renounce all earthly possessions. Indeed, because we know who we're made for, because we know who will put our restless hearts at ease, we now have freedom to enjoy the blessings that God provides to us on this earth for their own sake, within their proper contexts. I'm not striving after this thing because I think it's going to give me lasting happiness. It's just, there is something enjoyable about this thing, right? Whether it's food or fun or friendship or anything, right? But we can enjoy things in their proper context because we know whom we're made for. And so having this kind of perspective prevents us from elevating any one person, object, thing to the position of God or to the status of God in our lives. Now, the second charge is to keep alive the desire for our true country. And I think this is something that Christians often struggle with, is keeping that desire alive, not letting it get snowed under, not turning it aside. And Lewis he illustrates this beautifully in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader through the character Reepicheep. Now, I'll try not to spoil anything, as I did last year. I'll try to give as, for those who haven't read the Chronicles of Narnia, I'll try to, not spoil any story here. In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we find that Reepicheep is traveling with his companions, Caspian and his friends, and they've been on a long, long journey. And Reepicheep, throughout, he always has this higher hope for some country. He has this higher hope within him. And so the friends, they're discussing what sort of country Aslan's country is. And Lucy asked, "But what do you think?" said Lucy. Aslan's country would be the sort of you could ever sail to. "I do not know, madame," said Reepicheep. "But there's this. When I was in my cradle, a woodwoman, a dryad, spoke this verse over me. Where the sky and water meet, where the water waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, to find all you seek. There is the utter east. I do not know what this means, but the spell of it has been on me all my life." Is this not Reepicheep's own argument from desire? There's something more. The spell of it has been on him his entire life. He desires Aslan's country. And Lewis uses him as an illustration to remind us of the deep longing that we have. Right? We are still awaiting things to be complete. We are still waiting for all to be fulfilled. Right? But it's more than a feeling. It's a restlessness that we have until the object that we long for is in possession. But here's the thing. As Reepicheep displays, this restlessness is something that itself is a part of the adventure he's on. And for us, we're on a journey, right? We know our destination, but we're still on a journey. And the longing, the desiring for that country should be well and alive within us. This gives us an eternal perspective. And as we go through life, we realize this is a time of training, of sanctification. We're being prepared for that country with the Lord. Anyone who's here will remember their engagement period, if you had one. I remember the deep joy and anticipation I had for my wedding day, for the day that my deep longing and love for my wife would be fulfilled. That anticipation itself was a kind of joy. Am I starting to get emotive? And that's... there you go. Right? But there wasn't only that anticipation and longing, right? That restlessness in my spirit, that itself was a kind of joy. But there's preparations that took place. Preparing for that day, right? A getting ready for that long-awaited day. How much more joy should we experience as Christians as we prepare and we endure, as we await the love and longing of our souls? And what this does is it cuts completely against the escapist mindset. We're not to be ones holed up in isolation, waiting for the end of all things, as if we're just going to sit here and just wait for it, right? We're not in a waiting room. We're in a training room. If the epistles illustrate anything about the church, it's that we are to joyfully anticipate the coming of the Lord. And we're to do this together. We're to do it together. And at the end, maintaining this eternal perspective should impress upon us the importance to help as many as possible press on towards that country, which gets us to our third point. Lewis says that he must make it the main object of his life to press onto that country and to help others do the same. Taking into account this argument from desire, we know that a natural hunger is satisfied by food, right? We know that natural thirst is satisfied by water. But as this argument brings out, there is a spiritual thirst plaguing the human heart that nothing in this world fulfills. If you recall the woman at the well, Jesus answered her, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." Jeremiah brought this concept out a few weeks ago, the concept of living water, water for the soul. We know the location of the well. We know where the well's at. And so as we consider this, as we recognize who we are and where we're going, we need to make sure that we treat others according to their true value and not neglect to help as many people as possible obtain the same hope that we have. And so if there's some takeaways from this, I hope it stirs within you a sense of wonder at the Almighty God. That the things around us are just mere shadows. The goodness and the beauty, the truth, they're just mere shadows. That there's something much more, infinitely more than any joy or desire on this earth that we'll be in possession of. That will help us to treat things according to their proper value. It'll help us maintain an eternal perspective. And as we're going to be going into this new year looking more towards evangelism, trying to reach the lost. I hope this gives you some tools, some things that you might appeal to as we consider those things. So with that, I'm done. And I think we're going to be done now, right? No closing song? All right. I'll go ahead and pray, and then if you have any questions for me or you want to talk to me afterwards, I'm here. So, Heavenly Father, we thank you Um, we thank you for your word, how it teaches us. We thank you for the book of Ecclesiastes, Lord, that it just highlights the vanity of just chasing after things in this world. We also thank you for the great work of C.S. Lewis and the wisdom you gave him, Lord, that we can glean from it. And Lord, I just pray that the longings of our heart, that we would not, for you, that we would not stifle them. We would not let them get snowed in or turned aside, that we keep that alive through our love and service to one another. That by maintaining an eternal perspective, Lord, we treat things according to their proper value, that we treat people according to their true value, that we consider each other, consider and care for each other as we eagerly anticipate the fulfillment of all things in your Son, Jesus. We love you, Lord. We pray this in your name. Amen.